my name is Aaron Spitzer, a researcher at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen. And this presentation was originally called, or it still is, I guess, called Reclaiming Indigenous Land Developments in Canada, Lessons for Norway. But there have been some very interesting developments actually very recently here in Norway. And so I sort of am going to change up the theme of this presentation a little bit and make it more about developments, recent developments in Norway and lessons from Canada as relates to reclaiming Indigenous land. So came to the University of Bergen a couple of years ago from the Canadian Arctic in order to study Indigenous governance in a comparative perspective. And my objective was to compare aspects of Indigenous governance in two regions, the first being North America and especially Canada, because Canada, at least among advanced liberal democracies, is where it is generally felt the most dramatic developments in Indigenous governance have occurred in recent decades. You might have heard of the creation of Nunavut territory, for example, a federal jurisdiction created in Canada to provide regional self-governance for a large proportion of the Inuit population in northern Canada. So in addition to Canada, the second place that I sought to explore Indigenous governance in, or to compare Indigenous governance to, was the Fennoscandic region, i.e. Scandinavia and Finland and the Kola Peninsula of Russia, which is home to Europe's only recognized Indigenous people, the Sami. The gray area on that map of Fennoscandia is what could be considered the traditional Sami territory, sometimes called Sapmi. And in Sapmi, in Fennoscandia, I especially focused on the Norwegian situation because Norway firstly has the highest population of Sami, and it's also where in Fennoscandia the most dramatic Indigenous governance developments have taken place. So let's talk about those developments, both in Canada and in Norway. So since the 1970s, Indigenous people in both Canada and Norway have politically mobilized. The Sami mobilization in Norway, of course, was in reaction to Norway's plans to dam the Alta River up in Finnmark. The proposal was to flood reindeer pasture land. The dam would have disturbed the salmon migration, and it would have flooded the traditional Sami community of Masi. So in these political mobilizations, Indigenous people were seeking to exert greater control, as it is often said, of their lives and their land. Since then, since the 1970s or early 1980s, concerning their lives, Indigenous peoples in both places, this is a bit of a generalization, and of course varies from group to group, but they have won significant victories concerning traditional languages, for example, artistic and creative expression, and education, and areas like that. So in Norway, the Sami parliament, the Sametinget, which was instituted in the late 1980s up in Karasjok, up in Finnmark in the north, has acquired a degree of authority over all three of those areas of governance. So it's often said that Norway's Sami are an exemplar of a kind of authority. They're a classic case of a kind of authority that is often called non-territorial autonomy. So that means autonomy or self-governing authority or self-determination over cultural matters, over cultural affairs, but not over territorial affairs. Of course, authority over cultural affairs is important to many Indigenous groups, but it is not, of course, all that Indigenous peoples care about. Control of language and education, etc., may indeed give Indigenous people more control of their lives, of dimensions of their lives, but it gives them little control over their traditional lands. Providing control over lands is, in many ways, more difficult. So cultural matters like language and art and education, these are not what we could call zero-sum issues. I can speak my language, you can speak your language, and there is not necessarily an inherent conflict between having multiple languages being official languages in the same state. And indeed in Norway, at least in parts of Norway, both Norwegian and Sami are official languages. One could say that this is a type of solution that is a win-win solution. Both groups are potentially satisfied with the outcome. Land conflicts are often quite different. You very seldom, of course, can have win-win solutions with land conflicts. Land use is, for the most part, a zero-sum challenge where my win is going to be your loss or vice versa. The same parcel of land cannot both be a site of industrial development, of damming a river for hydroelectric usage in northern Norway, as well as being a site of reindeer herding. The village of Masi cannot both be flooded and be a home to Sami people, obviously, and a river can't be impounded to generate energy and also nurture a healthy wild-run salmon population, or at least it's quite difficult to do so. So these sorts of zero-sum win-lose land conflicts, you will recall, are exactly why the Alta affair, the Alta clash, happened in the first place in northern Norway. This was the whole reason why the Sami mobilization fired up in the 1970s and early 1980s in this country. So for Indigenous people to regain control of their land, non-territorial autonomy is not enough usually. You need, almost inevitably, you need territorial, you need land-related solutions. In Canada, the situation has been very much the same. In Canada, such solutions, or rather territorial solutions, solutions related to land use, began to debut, you could say, in the 1970s, and they are often called land claims settlements, land claim settlements. So since the 1970s in Canada, there have been more than 20, about 24 or so, land claim settlements achieved in the country, and they cover a map there. About half of Canada, mostly in the north, all those green areas are land claim settlements, and this amounts to an area that is, roughly the size of the continent of Europe. So it's an extensive amount of area of Canada that has been subject to Indigenous land claim settlements. As the map in the upper left of that map there indicates, these land claim settlements are sometimes called modern treaties. And like any treaty, these are agreements that are arrived at through negotiations between two peoples, if you will, two sovereigns. So they're arrived at between the country of Canada on one side and the First Nations or Métis or Inuit people, the three major Indigenous groups that are in Canada, on the other side. So I want to go into detail about what these modern treaties, these land claims settlements, entail. What are the components of these land claim settlements? They're not all the same, but they have largely followed the same kind of pattern since 1975. So I'm going to talk about the components of these land claim settlements by going through the example of one particular settlement that's very close to the part of Canada where I lived before I came to Norway. This was a settlement that was operationalized in 2003 by the Klitschko Act. So the Clicho are an indigenous group, an indigenous nation that is part of the larger sort of Dene cultural and language family up in northern Canada. The Clicho historic territory is that red area up in the north right there, and we're going to zoom in and talk a little bit about it. So that is the southern part of Canada's Northwest Territories, which is one of the 13 federal subunits in Canada. One of the three, Canada basically has 10 provinces, and then it has 3 what are called territories up in the northern part of the country. Northwest Territories is one of those 3. So this land claim settlement, the Clicho land claim settlement, began with the Clicho demanding to the country of Canada that action be taken. The Clicho were once sovereign roughly over this area. You could call this area roughly a Clicho traditional territory. I haven't drawn it perfectly on the map. So the Clicho, of course, used and lived in and had a spiritual relationship with this area for hundreds or thousands of years, since time immemorial, as it's often said. And even after white people came to this area in the largely in the 1800s and 1900s, the Clicho never legally ceded sovereignty over this territory. They never formally gave up their authority over this territory. And yet, Canada, in the course of the 19th and the 20th century, came to sort of assume ownership over this area. So the area just came to be sort of considered to be part of Canada. So you end up with 2 conflicting claims to sovereignty. The Clicho having never ceded the land, and Canada obviously acting now as if it owns the land and exercises political sovereignty over it. So the land claim settlement, land claim negotiations begin with the Clicho basically filing a land claim, arguing that they never gave up this land and Canada claims it, and somebody needs to reconcile this dilemma, this clash of views as to who owns this land. So there are several steps to the land claim negotiations, the land claim settlements. And the first step is agreeing on what land the Clicho would continue to exercise sovereignty over. So to determine what part will remain Clicho land, where the Clicho will have land title. And in this case, the Clicho land title that they won during the negotiations was this red, the solid red area. The Clicho Act, the Clicho Settlement of 2003, gave them uncontested ownership of the red area at the heart, the core of their historic territory. The rest of the area outside the solid red portion, but within that, the red line, was ceded to Canada. So some of the land, the core of the land goes to the Clicho, the rest of it is ceded to Canada, but that is not the end of the land claim settlement. That's just sort of the beginning of it. Once the key dispute, the ownership of the land, was resolved, other elements of the settlement flowed from there. So in exchange for their claim to, in exchange for the Clicho surrendering that sort of peripheral area to Canada, they got certain rights and benefits. And this is how most land claims in Canada work. Those rights and benefits include a cash settlement, once again, in exchange for formally ceding that territory to the country of Canada. The rights and benefits include user rights, for example, the right to hunt, fish, trap in the ceded area. So enduring indigenous sort of use rights. And then a key further element is land co-management. So what do I mean by land co-management? I mean that in this area, the ceded area, the Clicho and Canada make decisions jointly. They are co-deciders, co-managers over land-related matters. So over natural resource development, environmental regulation, wildlife management, and that sort of thing. And this land co-management, these land use decisions, in this case, in the case of the Klitscho Act, are performed by a body called the Wakaji Board, the Wakaji Land and Water Board. The Wakaji Land and Water Board is what could be thought of as a power sharing board. So a portion of the members of the Wakaji Board are appointed by the Klitscho First Nations government, and a portion are appointed by, or they're named by, the public governments, so the Northwest Territories government and the government of Canada. So you basically have representation from, if you want to think of it in really stark terms, from the Indigenous side and the white government. A classic sort of consociational or power sharing type of organization. So that's how land claim settlements have typically worked in Canada, in the case of the Klitscho and all these various other ones that have come to cover most of northern Canada. So now let's jump to Norway and talk about some recent developments there. So it is a little appreciated fact that in Norway, up in Finnmark, the northernmost county, or it used to be a standalone county before it got merged with Troms County. In Finnmark, the Sami have also for the last 20 years been in what I would call a land claims settlement process. So this is kind of the first and still really the only, I think, what could be called an Indigenous land claim settlement process in Europe. So the Sami land claim settlement process was instituted in this case in Norway by the 2005 Finnmark Act. So under the Finnmark Act, in my view, and some people might dispute this, but the Finnmark Act, I think, has done many of the same things that a Canadian land claim does. But as I'm going to argue in this presentation, I think many of those same things that the Finnmark Act has done have been sequenced in a different order, in a different or maybe even a strange order compared to the way that they are sequenced in Canada. So they have been instituted, in my view, in a way that sort of has placed the cart before the horse. So under the Finnmark Act of 2005, the first thing to happen was the institution of land co-management. Not the last thing to happen, which is sort of what takes place in Canada, but rather the first step was to institute land co-management. This occurred through the institution and empowerment of a body called the Finnmarks Eiendom, or FIFO, which began exercising jurisdiction over nearly all of Finnmark. So as in Canada, FIFO is a land co-management, or I think of it as a land co-management body. It's similar to the Wakaji Board that I spoke about in Canada, in that it's a power sharing body. In the case of the FIFO board, half of the members of the board are named by the Sami parliament that I spoke of, the Sami parliament based in Karasjok. And then half of the members of FIFO are named by the, it used to be Finnmark, but now the Troms og Finnmark Fylkeskommune, the county council. So not the Storting, not the national government of Norway, but rather the regional public government, the county public government. These board members together, the FIFO board, similar again to the Wakaji board in Canada, they make decisions over land, over territorial related matters. So they make decisions over natural resource development, hunting, fishing, etc. So once again, the structure of this board and its responsibilities are similar to the land co-management boards that are instituted under many of the land claims, maybe most of the land claims in Canada. So after creating and empowering this co-management board in Finnmark, other developments from the Finnmark Act flowed from there. But as you can see from the direction of my arrow, I think of them as flowing uphill. They're sort of flowing in the other direction as the Canadian land claims. So, for example, after Finnmark's eyendoms sort of took over the co-management of most of the land in the Finnmark area, you also had the creation and empowerment of the Finnmark Commission. And the duty of the Finnmark Commission is to deal with the clarification of land title in Finnmark. So to sort out who exactly owns what in Finnmark, very much like in Northern Canada, where ownership of the land was historically contested between Indigenous groups and the state. The same situation has sort of prevailed in Norway. Norway just sort of came to assume, to claim sovereignty over the North without the Sami ever having really formally given it up through any process. So the Finnmark Commission is in a similar kind of way, an attempt to reconcile a dispute as to who owns precise parcels of land in the North. So the Finnmark Commission has sought to do this, has sought to reconcile land ownership in Finnmark County. It sought to kind of go area by area, or what they call field by field. So like so, and it takes a couple of years and it surveys all of the land in these various fields, and it assigns, it makes a decision, issues a decision assigning formal land title in each of these areas. It assigns, or it's tasked with assigning formal land title to the Sami, both as individual people or as collectives, and also to non-Sami. So it's a sort of a broad attempt to clarify ownership of the land. Now, for the most part, over the past 15 years of its operation, the Finnmark Commission has in fact assigned Sami very little formal land title. So there's been very little assignment of Sami land, or assignment of land to non-Sami. The vast majority of the land in these three fields that it has surveyed have remained basically public land. So they have remained under the jurisdiction of FIFO, under the jurisdiction of the Finnmark's eiyendom. As you can see, those three fields, those three parts of Finnmark that the Finnmark Commission has been working in are in what is called outer Finnmark. So they are out on the coast. And outer Finnmark is the part of Finnmark that is the most non-Sami. It's where the lowest proportion of Sami live, I guess you could say. The Sami are population-wise most concentrated in inner Finnmark. And it was finally last year, almost exactly a year ago, that the Finnmark Commission finally issued its first report on a field in inner Finnmark. And that field in inner Finnmark was for the area of Karasjok, which is here. Remember I said that the Sami parliament is based in Karasjok. So for that field, for that area, the Finnmark Commission, after having not made a lot of dramatic decisions for the first 15 years of its operation, suddenly it issued a ruling on the ownership of land in Karasjok that was quite dramatic. The commission declared that basically all of the land of Karasjok municipality is collectively owned by the residents of Karasjok. And the overwhelming proportion of the residents of Karasjok are Sami. So they didn't explicitly assign the land to the Sami or to people as indigenous people, but they assigned it in a de facto kind of way that would give Sami collective land title over this area. So in this kind of slightly indirect way, I would argue that this was, in many ways, the first real assignment of collective native land title in Europe. This was the first real return of land from a state to indigenous hands. And this happened almost exactly 1 year ago. And it got relatively little play, frankly, I think in Norway. It certainly didn't get much play outside of Norway, but it's kind of a momentous development in indigenous land reclamation, I believe. Maybe the reason it didn't get that much attention is because it has encountered some uncertainties. So assigning this land to the residents of Karasjok is, of course, going to diminish the scope of authority of FIFO, which was, as I said, already exercising land co-management authority over the whole of Finnmark County, including Karasjok municipality. So this created a conflict, basically, between two different institutional interests, two different institutions that were established under the Finnmark Act, between the Finnmark's Eiendom, the land co-management body, and the Finnmark's Commission, which is supposed to sort of figure out what land belongs outright to the Sami people. So as evidence of this clash between institutions, a couple of weeks ago, on the 15th of October, the director of FIFO, of the co-management body, the director, who is himself a well-known Sami person, issued a report on the Finnmark Commission's decision with this conclusion at the very end of it was maybe 80 pages. It was a substantial document, but the very final paragraph says, in translation, this is maybe a rough translation, but the board of FIFO cannot accept the Finnmark Commission's conclusion that Karasjok municipality is collectively owned by the population of Karasjok municipality. The director urged instead that the matter be taken to court to decide. So you have basically the director, the chief public servant, I guess you could say, serving the Finnmark's Eiendom, recommending that FIFO itself not accept the conclusions of the Finnmark's Commission, not accept that this land be turned over collectively to the residents of Karasjok. That's a fairly dramatic clash of views within a land claim settlement process. So I thought that was where my presentation was going to end, sort of pointing out this strange institutional standoff that is, in some ways, one could argue, thwarting or certainly complicating Europe's first ever native land claim settlement. But then just a few days ago, a couple days ago, last week, there was a meeting of the FIFO board. These are the members who, like I said, are appointed by, 3 of them appointed by the Saamidigi, the Sami parliament, and 3 of them appointed by the county council. They had a meeting to decide this question. Does FIFO support the commission's decision that the land of Karasjok is owned not by Norway, but by the people of Karasjok, the vast majority of whom are Sami? Or does FIFO support the director's view that this question cannot be decided by the commission, but should be decided in court? The FIFO board voted on this very momentous question, and as is perhaps not surprising, in a power-sharing body, they split right down the middle. They split 3-3. The 3 appointees of the Sami parliament were in favor of Karasjok getting the land, so in favor of the land going, in effect, to indigenous hands, while the 3 appointees of the county council voted against it. Under FIFO's structure, the chair of of the board gets a double vote, a tie-breaking vote. In case of a tie, this year, the chair is a Sami parliament appointee, and she voted to break the tie in favor of what you could call the Sami parliament position. So she voted in support of the land going to Karasjok. This is a big deal. It's not just a big deal for the reason that I said, that it's probably, you could say it's the first indigenous return of land title to indigenous hands in Europe. It's also a big deal for what it bodes for the future. So the logic undergirding the commission's decision means that it is probably not just Karasjok that is going to potentially end up in Sami hands. Also, the land in Kautokeino municipality, based on the logic of the commission's decision, they probably, when they survey the Kautokeino municipality, they probably will come to the same conclusion that that area will go to the local population, most of whom, almost all of whom are Sami. And it is also likely that the same will be decided for part of, and these, once again, I've drawn these on the map, but these are very roughly approximate. There's no legal standing to what I've drawn on this map. But in general, this large solid red area is the area that, if all things continue as they seem to be going, could potentially be collectively owned by the local and overwhelmingly Sami population of inner Finnmark. All in all, that is an area that is bigger than 15,000 square, or it's an area around 15,000 square kilometers. So that is not it's not an unsubstantial fraction of the population or of the land area of Norway. It's bigger than, I looked it up, it's bigger than some sovereign states like Montenegro and Qatar. So it's not huge, but it's still a big deal. So will it happen? Question mark. That is, I guess that remains unclear. There are still a number of institutional hurdles for this process to clear. It seems to have cleared what I see as at least one strange hurdle, and that is the resistance from the FIFO director himself. And this leads to my very tentative conclusion of this presentation, which is, if Norway had it to do over again, or if it followed the Canadian order of executing these land claim settlements, I think Norway would have perhaps first wanted to have identified indigenous land title at the beginning through the Finnmark Commission or some sort of similar process, and then have instituted land co-management through a body such as FIFO. You ended up with this potential, what you could say in political science is a kind of a path dependency, where once you had created FIFO and it had become institutionalized, it became resistant to land authority being taken away from it. Strange case of sequencing a land claim. I think that I am going to leave it there. That is the end of what I have. So I think now we can open it up for any kind of questions. I'm going to go away from my screen share. I'm not sure if one of the moderators is going to come back on. So it looks like there's Celia.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for your interesting talk. And I will read you some of the questions. We have received some in the chat. The first one is, who is on the Finnmark Commission?
That is a great question, and I am not the authority to answer that. It is the Finnmark, I believe that the members of the Finnmark Commission, similar to the members on the FIFO board, are appointed in a sort of a power sharing manner. So you have some members who are chosen by the Samadigi, by the Sami parliament, and you have some members who are chosen by public governments, and whether that's by the county council or by the central Norwegian state, I'm actually not sure about the answer to that. But it also is sort of structured in I believe, in a kind of a power sharing sort of way, which is not surprising given that it was the entire result. I mean, every indigenous land claim settlement could be seen as being a negotiated compromise between two sovereigns. And so in so many cases, the bodies that are created by these land claim settlements are power sharing bodies. They're co-management bodies where you have part of the authority assigned by one group, part by the other, and the challenge is them coming together and coming up with solutions that serve everybody on these land use disputes, which are, like I said, very sort of, it's difficult to come up with win-win solutions on these land issues.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is kind of a long one, so bear with me. But why do national states agree to negotiate land claims with indigenous people? Is it based on a recognition of indigenous people claims and belongings? Do some of the other cases of such negotiation and land claims then, do you know of any other cases of such a negotiation and land claims than Canada and Norway? Would you like to comment? The second question is, would you like to comment on how knowledge about land claims travels across countries and conflicts? Indigeneity, settler colonism, decolonization has, for example, emerged the last decade as keywords in academic research on Israel-Palestine.
That is a great series of questions. So let's take it from the top. Why do states agree to negotiate land claims with indigenous peoples? Well, one would like to say it's because states have this desire to adhere to the cherished values of liberal democracy. But of course, that is that may be what they say, but in so many cases, where a land claim settlement comes about, it is because the hand of the state is forced. So the very first land claim settlement, you could almost say that the very first land claim settlement that followed the pattern that I talked about was not in Canada or in Norway, but in fact in the United States. And that was the what's called the ANCSA settlement, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, I think it's called, in very early 1970s in Alaska. And that was when Alaska, right after Alaska discovered oil on their North Slope, right about the same time that Norway discovered its oil, Alaska faced a challenge. It needed to get the oil out of the biggest oil find ever discovered in the United States. It needed to get that oil out of the North Slope. It needed a way to do it. It wanted to build a pipeline, and that was going to be a very sort of environmentally intrusive process. And they potentially faced all of these lawsuits from indigenous groups that were very disturbed by the idea that the state or the country was just going to expropriate land that the indigenous people had used for thousands of years. And so the state of Alaska, in order to avoid this series of lawsuits from a whole bunch of different indigenous groups, it proposed a plan to settle the land claims of these indigenous groups in Canada. And so that's where you kind of got the first land claim settlement, modeling on that Alaska settlement was the first claim in Canada, which was the James Bay and Northern Quebec Accord. That came about because Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, was going to dam a whole bunch of rivers to create the James Bay hydroelectric project. So very similar roots as the Alta affair in Norway. And then of course in Norway, like I said, the same thing. So in so many of these cases, countries initiate a land claim settlement, or the land claim settlements are dramatically accelerated when natural resource development, when, if you will, money making hangs in the balance. So there have been land claim settlements. There was a land claim settlement in Labrador in Canada, which drug on for decades until somebody found, I think it was a deposit of nickel, a valuable mineral, basically, in the land area. And then suddenly the land claim settlement swung into action. It was resolved within, a few years, basically. I'm just looking at the other of the parts of this question. So that's the sort of I won't even say the cynical, it's just the political realist answer to the question. Of course, Norway is a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as some other international agreements. Countries like Norway do have, they want to maintain their international standing as a good actor. And so there is international law and sometimes domestic law pressure to engage in these land claims as well. I don't want to be totally cynical about it. How well does these land claim ideas travel to other contexts? Well, I would say they have traveled quite well, as exemplified by the Alaska, Canada, and Norway situation. They've traveled quite well, especially in northern and Arctic peripheries, and that's the sort of areas that I tend to study. It is extremely hard for me to imagine them traveling to a densely populated and hotly contested area like Israel, Palestine. Certainly the theories that apply to indigenous governance studies have been applied to the Israeli-Palestine conflict, I think, to great avail. Do the solutions that Canada has been able to institute, for example, would they work in a place like that? I think it would be dramatically more challenging. In some ways, well, yeah, I won't go any further than that. Yeah.
Thank you. And another question here. Will you write about this?
I may. It's been quite exciting, actually, this conflict that's taken place in Norway. I think it's one of the challenges of Indigenous, as much as there's sort of been an internationalization of Indigenous high politics. Like there are a lot of international meetings, there's a lot of international law that relates to Indigenous governance, and yet so many of the actual solutions of Indigenous governance are very country specific, or they seem to take place in sort of isolated bubbles within countries. And I was surprised when I came to Norway even how little communication interaction there is, even between Norway and Sweden and Finland and Russia. These are countries that are very close together and with shared Sami population. Yet even a lot of the politics between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups in these countries takes place in silos, in the isolated bubbles of these countries. So being able to sort of bring some insights from Canada to the Norwegian situation and vice versa is super fruitful. So it's really exciting to see a development like this taking place in Norway and say, well, this looked very similar to something that's happened in Canada, but it's happening in a very sort of strange order. It's sequenced in a way that wouldn't be familiar to Canadian land claims negotiators. So yeah, I do want to write up something about it at some point.
Good. Next question is, what are the implications of having local control rather than Sami control of the land title?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Well, one of the implications is that it is probably incrementally more politically palatable. And I'm speaking here now well outside of my knowledge area. So the question is, as I take it, the question is sort of like, why didn't the Finnmark's Commission assign land title and Karasjok to the Sami? Why didn't they say that it goes to the indigenous people rather than sort of saying, oh, just to the local population? That obviously is presumably a bit of a political compromise. So much of the language of the FIFO, of the Finnmark Act, is kind of couched in the same sort of terms. The Finnmark Act is written so as to be, as it is often said, ethnically neutral, which seems really strange for an act that is supposed to resolve an indigenous land claim. But a lot of the language in it is that it is not favoring, indigenous people because they are indigenous. It's assigning land to certain people who, and it's upholding indigenous values in doing so, or it's assigning land to them because they have been long-term owners, and the fact that they're indigenous is why they're long-term owners, or things like that. So there's an enormous amount of attempt to walk this tightrope, I guess, in these, and it's not just in this, in the Finnmark Act. A lot of the land claim settlements in Canada as well run into these challenges where you have, like, there are indigenous governance bodies that are created in Canadian land claim settlements where the desire is to give power to indigenous groups, but you can't necessarily violate the Canadian Constitution by explicitly disenfranchising non-indigenous people because of their race. That would potentially precipitate Supreme Court challenges. So there's this attempt to sort of walk this fine line where indigenous people will have more power, but there will still be representation on these bodies accorded to non-indigenous people as well. These negotiations it's often very unsatisfying to read through a land claim or a self-government negotiation resolution like this, because they are trying to be all things to all people in many ways. They are inherently compromises, and compromises are seldom clean. They are invariably kind of muddled, and sometimes they are muddled in a way that the two parties sat down and they came up with some kind of agreement on paper that they could both sign off on, but they actually leave the nitty-gritty of the decision is sort of left for future generations to sort of hammer out, or it's left for a court to ultimately resolve. So in many cases, the actual meaning, the actual interpretation of these land claims settlements is a little bit kind of fuzzy, but that is simply the nature of treaty making in so many cases. It's you would never get to an agreement if you sort of attempted to deal with every potentiality at the negotiating table. You have to sort of punt it forward to future people to sign of work out.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Will FIFO bring its case to court?
I think the next step, and again, this is sort of something that I'm out of, it's out of my expertise. I believe the next step, because, and this is written into the Finnmark Act, because the vote of the FIFO board was 4-3, so it was nearly a split decision. I believe on any 4-3 decision, or maybe 4-3 decisions that relate to specific kinds of matters, after FIFO makes its decision, the decision is then kicked up to the two parent organizations that feed into FIFO, which is the Sami Parliament and the Finnmark County Commission. So I leave this question of is the Finnmark Commission right? Does the land go to the population of Karasjok? That question is next going to go to the Sami Parliament and to the Finnmark County Council to decide. And one might guess that the Sami Parliament is going to say yes. And one might guess that the Finnmark and the Troms on Finnmark County Council is going to say no. And then I am guessing then it becomes a matter for the courts. But this is sort of, as far as I know, this is sort of uncharted territory. Even though the Finnmark Act has been around for 15 years, it hasn't gotten into something exactly like this. But I don't know the precise legal steps that take place next.
Yeah, and this is the last question we have. I wondered if you might know anything about other parts of Sami. How is the situation in Sweden, Finland, or maybe Russia? Are there any recent land claim negotiations?
Well, as you go east from Norway, the population of Sami in each of those countries becomes smaller and smaller, and you could say the amount of self-governing authority that they exercise also sort of diminishes. So Norway not only has the strongest body in the Sami parliament, but it also has progressed the furthest on land claims, if you will. Sweden, less so, Finland less than that, and Russia is basically barely even recognizes its Sami population as being a rights-bearing group. So my perception is that in each of those countries, I mentioned earlier that the Sami of Norway exercise something like what is often called in political science non-territorial autonomy. I would say the battle in Finland and Russia is to even achieve non-territorial autonomy. It's to even achieve as much control as the Norwegian Sami have over cultural type affairs. A land claim, a land co-management kind of process, I think it's something that they are not even close to, and it would be extremely hard to imagine, for example, in Russia, at least under the current circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who attended, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, Aaron Spitzer. Yeah, thank you for a great seminar.
Thank you, Celia. Thanks, everybody.